The fog rolls in thick over Willow Hollow just before dawn, the kind that doesn't burn away with sunlight but clings to the earth like something living, something that remembers. In the autumn of 1895, when the leaves turned the color of dried blood and the wind carried voices that had no source, there existed a family in the backwoods of eastern Kentucky whose name was spoken only in whispers. The Adderleys. A name that once meant prosperity, land ownership, influence in 3 counties. But by that year it meant something else entirely, something the town records would later try to erase, something the church refused to acknowledge. In the archives of the Carter County Courthouse, there exists a ledger with 7 pages torn out. The binding shows the violence of their removal. On the page before the gap, a single entry remains. Adderley Union, September 14th. God forgive what we have witnessed. On the page after, nothing but a water stain shaped like a handprint. Between those pages lived a secret that would consume an entire bloodline. This is not a story about love. This is not a story about choice. This is a story about what happens when a family decides that their blood is too precious to share with the outside world, and what crawled out of that decision wearing human skin. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Adderley family arrived in Willow Hollow in 1862, during the war that tore the nation in half. They came with money, which made them different. They came with land deeds, which made them powerful. And they came with a conviction that their lineage was sacred, which would make them monsters. The patriarch, Silas Adderley, purchased 400 acres of bottomland along Kettle Creek, where the water ran dark even in summer and the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight. He built a house there, a towering structure of hand-hewn timber and river stone, with windows that reflected the sky in ways that hurt to look at too long. The locals called it the Gray House, though its wood was dark as a bruise. Silas had 3 sons and 2 daughters. He educated them himself, trusted no outside teacher, permitted no socialization with town children. By 1870, the Adderleys were wealthy beyond measure, their timber operation supplying 3 states, but they remained strangers to their neighbors. They attended no church. They participated in no socials. When they came to town, they moved as a unit, silent, purchasing supplies with gold coins that seemed older than America itself. The trouble began, as it always does, with the children. By 1885, the second generation of Adderleys had reached marrying age. Silas had 7 grandchildren, 4 girls and 3 boys, all born within 6 years of each other, all raised in that house by the creek where the water ran wrong. The nearest suitable families, families of equal wealth and standing, were 30 miles away over mountain roads that killed horses and broke wagon axles. Silas was 70 years old. His sons, the fathers of these grandchildren, looked to him for guidance. What happened next was recorded in a letter found in 1897, stuffed behind a loose board in the Gray House's attic. The letter, written by a maid who worked there briefly, describes a family meeting held on Christmas Eve of 1885. Mr. Silas stood before the fire, the letter reads, and declared that God had brought them to this valley to preserve something pure, something untainted by the lesser bloods of common folk. He said the grandchildren would marry among themselves, that the cousins would be joined to keep the line clean. The sons nodded. The mothers wept but said nothing. The children, present for this proclamation, showed no expression at all. That was what frightened me most. They already knew. They had been prepared. The first wedding took place in April of 1886. Jeremiah Adderley, age 19, married his first cousin Ruth, age 17. There was no minister. Silas performed the ceremony himself, reading from a book that was not the Bible, though it was leather-bound and old. The maid's letter continues. Ruth wore white, but her face was gray. Jeremiah held her hand like a man holding a rope that might slip. When Silas pronounced them wed, Ruth made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, but something in between, something animal. That night I heard noises from their room that I cannot describe in Christian language. In the morning, Ruth would not leave her bed. Her eyes were open, but she saw nothing. She stayed that way for 3 days. Within a year, Ruth bore a son. The town doctor, called to the gray house for the delivery, wrote in his private journal, an entry discovered after his death in 1903, "I have delivered over 200 infants in my 30 years of practice. What I pulled from Ruth Adderley was my 201st, but I hesitate to count it among the others. It breathed. It moved. But its proportions were wrong in ways I lack the medical vocabulary to articulate. The skull was soft in places it should be hard, hard in places it should be soft. The eyes, God help me, the eyes did not align properly and they did not track together. When I expressed concern, Silas dismissed me with gold coins and a warning that if I spoke of the child's condition, my practice would be ended and my family would suffer. I took the money. I have prayed every night since for forgiveness." By 1890, 3 more cousin marriages had occurred within the Adderley family. Each union was performed in that house, away from any authority that might object, any law that might intervene. The children born from these unions were never seen in town. The Adderleys hired wet nurses from distant counties, women who came, served 6 months and left richer but silent. One nurse, however, broke that silence before she died. In 1894, a woman named Clara Hobbs lay dying of influenza in a charity hospital in Lexington. A nun attending her recorded her final confession. "Those Bobbies," Clara whispered, "they weren't right. All 4 of them born in that house while I was there, none of them right. The oldest boy, he was 5 when I arrived, couldn't speak plain words, only sounds like an animal learning language. The twin girls born while I tended them, they came out holding each other, fingers intertwined, and the doctor, a different one each time, always from far away, he tried to separate their hands and couldn't. They had to cut. And they didn't cry, not once, not during birth, not during cutting, not ever. Just stared with eyes too old for newborns. The family treated it as normal. That was worse than the children themselves. The acceptance. The pride even. Silas would hold these wrong children and smile like he'd accomplished something holy. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In the spring of 1893, a traveling preacher came through Willow Hollow. He was not invited to the gray house, but he heard the stories. Every town has stories, whispers shared over fences and in general stores, and Willow Hollow's stories all circled back to the Adderleys. The preacher, a man named Elijah Thorne, kept a detailed diary of his travels. His entry for May 7, 1893, describes an encounter at a local inn. "I asked about the family on Kettle Creek, having heard disturbing rumors of isolated practices and concerning births. The innkeeper's wife, a stout woman of perhaps 50 years, crossed herself and would not meet my eyes. Her husband warned me to let the matter rest. But a young man, a farmhand, drunk on corn whiskey, leaned close and spoke low. He said his sister had been hired as a laundress at the gray house the previous year. She lasted 2 weeks. When she returned, she would not speak of what she'd seen, but she woke screaming for months after. The only words they could extract from her nightmares were the children's room and all of them watching. She left Kentucky entirely, went west, and has not written since." Thorne decided to visit the gray house. His diary continues, "I walked the road to Kettle Creek on May 9th. The closer I came to the Adderley property, the more the natural world seemed to withdraw. Bird song ceased. The insects fell silent. Even the wind felt reluctant. The house emerged from the trees like a growth, something that belonged to the landscape the way a tumor belongs to flesh. I approached the front gate and was met by 2 men, identical in appearance, cold in demeanor. They did not ask my business. They simply stood between me and the house until I retreated. As I left, I heard a child's laughter from within, high and wrong, like wind through a crack in glass." By 1894, the town of Willow Hollow had become complicit through silence. The Adderley wealth touched everyone. They owned the sawmill that employed 40 men. They held mortgages on a dozen farms. Their money paid for the church's new roof, the school's textbooks, the doctor's equipment. To speak against them was to risk financial ruin. But silence has a weight, and that weight was crushing the town's conscience. In October of 1894, a petition appeared on the door of the county courthouse. It was unsigned, written in a careful hand, and it called for an investigation into the Adderley family's practices. It cited rumors of unlawful marriages, concerns about the welfare of children, requests for health inspections of the Gray House. The petition vanished within hours. The county judge, a man named Harlan Curtis, had received significant campaign contributions from Silas Adderley. No investigation occurred, but something else happened. 3 weeks after the petition appeared, a fire consumed the home of the town's postmaster. His family escaped, but every letter, every record, every piece of correspondence that passed through Willow Hollow was reduced to ash. Among those letters, it was later whispered, were several from concerned citizens to the state capitol, requesting intervention in the Adderley matter. The fire was ruled accidental. The postmaster's daughter, aged 12, told a different story to her schoolteacher, but only once and never again. "I saw a man standing across the road that night," she said, "tall and thin and perfectly still, watching our house burn. He looked like Mr. Jeremiah Adderley, but older, wrong somehow, like a reflection that doesn't match. When our dog ran at him, barking, the man opened his mouth and the dog stopped, just froze mid-run, then turned and ran so hard into the woods we never saw it again." In February of 1895, the situation reached a critical point that would finally force the town's hand, though not through courage but through horror too great to ignore. A young woman named Violet Adderley, aged 20, daughter of Silas's eldest son, appeared in town alone for the first time in her life. She walked into the general store on a Tuesday morning, her dress torn, her feet bare despite the freezing mud, her face marked with bruises in the distinct pattern of fingers. She carried a bundle wrapped in a stained blanket. The store owner, Thomas Marsh, would testify later, though his testimony was stricken from official records. She set the bundle on the counter gentle-like and unwrapped it slow. Inside was an infant, maybe 2 months old, dead for at least one. The smell hit me and I stepped back, but she didn't seem to notice the smell or the state of the child. She looked at me with eyes that held no tears, no emotion at all, and said, "This is what they made us make. This is the 4th one that came out wrong. We buried the others in the cellar, but I carried this one out so someone would know, so someone would see what happens when blood gets too close to itself. We're all cousins married to cousins now, all of us, and everything we make is broken." Violet collapsed before she could say more. She was taken to the doctor, who found her malnourished, covered in bruises of various ages, and suffering from what he termed in his notes, a complete dissolution of rational faculties. She would never speak coherently again. The infant's body was taken for examination, and what the doctor found was documented in a report he sealed and marked to be opened only after his death. That report surfaced in 1928. In clinical language, it describes deformities so severe that the child could not have survived long after birth. Fused bones, underdeveloped organs, a skull structure that the doctor noted was reminiscent of developmental disorders I have read about in medical literature concerning isolated populations where intermarriage has occurred across multiple generations. The cause of death was listed as failure to thrive, but the doctor added a handwritten note in the margin, or perhaps mercy. The authorities could no longer ignore what had been brought literally to their doorstep. On February 20th, 1895, Sheriff Coleman Porter, accompanied by 2 deputies and the county judge, rode to the Gray House with a warrant to inspect the premises and inquire into the welfare of all residents. They brought with them a minister and a doctor, preparing for whatever they might find. The sheriff's official report is brief and vague, stating only that the family was found in residence cooperative and that no evidence of wrongdoing was observed. But Sheriff Porter's private letters, found among his effects after his death in 1912, tell a profoundly different story. In a letter to his brother dated March 1, 1895, Porter wrote, "I have seen war. I saw men torn apart at Shiloh and left to die in mud that swallowed them. I thought I understood horror. But what I witnessed in that house on Kettle Creek has undone something in me that I fear will never heal. They let us in without resistance, which should have been the first warning. Silas met us at the door, now ancient bent, but with eyes as sharp as blades. He invited us into a parlor where the entire family was assembled. 14 adults, all bearing the Adderley features, those sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes, all sitting in perfect silence. And the children. God above, the children. There were 9 of them, ranging in age from infant to perhaps 12 years. Not one looked fully human in a way I can articulate. Their proportions were subtly wrong. Their movements were too fluid in some ways, too stiff in others. 3 could not speak at all, only made clicking sounds in their throats. 2 others spoke, but in unison, completing each other's sentences, as if sharing one mind between 2 bodies. The oldest boy, the one Clara Hobbs had mentioned in her confession, sat in the corner, rocking, his head too large for his thin neck, his hands clasped together in a gesture that looked prayerful until you realized his fingers were knotted together, actually grown together in places, fused. The doctor examined several children at Silas's invitation. I watched the doctor's face drain of color. He found curved spines, joints that bent wrong directions, teeth that grew in multiple rows, skin that bruised from the lightest touch. And through it all, the family watched us with expressions of pride. Pride. As if they had created something remarkable rather than something that should never have been allowed to exist. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The letter continues with details that grow increasingly disturbing. The judge asked to see the cellar, having heard Violet's claims about buried children. Silas agreed without hesitation. He led us down stone steps into a space that should have been a root cellar but was instead something else entirely. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars. Dozens of jars. In each jar, suspended in liquid I hope was preservative alcohol, were specimens. Infants that had not survived. Children born so malformed that they had lived minutes, hours, days at most. Silas spoke of them with the detachment of a scientist discussing failed experiments. These were the Lord's way of purifying the line, he said. The weak are culled, the strong continue. Each generation we are closer to what we were meant to be. I asked him what that was, what they were meant to be. He smiled, and that smile is what haunts me most. Pure, he said, undefined by the contamination of outsider blood. In 3 more generations, we will be something this world has not seen since before the flood. We will be worthy. The minister with us began to pray aloud, clutching his Bible. Silas turned to him and said, "Your God is for the weak masses who accept dilution. We serve an older principle. Blood calls to blood, like to like, and from that union comes transcendence." The judge demanded we leave immediately. He wanted to arrest Silas, to remove the children, to burn the entire place to the ground. But we all knew that any action we took would be blocked by the Adderley money, their influence, their lawyers who would descend from Frankfurt and Louisville with arguments about rights and property and lack of concrete laws broken. So we left. We left those children in that house, and I will answer for that cowardice when I meet my Maker. The town of Willow Hollow fractured in the days following the sheriff's visit. Those who depended on Adderley money defended them, calling the sheriff's concerns exaggerated, the product of prejudice against an unusual but harmless family. Others, those who had seen Violet's dead infant or heard whispers of the cellar's contents, demanded action. A town meeting was called for March 10, 1895. The church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway. The meeting minutes survive, typed neatly and filed in the county archives, but they capture nothing of the passion and fear described in newspaper accounts. The Willow Hollow Gazette, a weekly paper that ceased publication in 1898, ran a front-page story on March 14th that described the meeting as a descent into chaos mirroring the moral decay at the heart of the issue itself. Witnesses shouted. Fistfights broke out. Women wept openly. One man, a farmer named Josiah Tucker, stood and described how his daughter had once played with Adderley children at a county fair, back before the family fully isolated itself. "My Caroline was 8 years old," Tucker said, "and she came home that day disturbed, shaken in a way I couldn't understand. She said the Adderley children played a game where they pretended to be one person, finishing each other's thoughts, moving in mirror images. She said when she asked their names, all four of them answered as if they shared one identity. She said their eyes were wrong, that they looked at her like something examining prey. I laughed it off then, called it childhood imagination. But 2 years later, Caroline still won't enter the woods on the south side of our property, the side that faces Kettle Creek. She says they're watching from there. She says she can feel them watching still." The meeting produced a resolution, carefully worded to avoid legal repercussions, requesting that the state of Kentucky send officials to evaluate the Adderley family situation. The resolution was signed by 37 citizens and forwarded to Frankfort. It arrived at the Capitol on March 21st. By March 24th, it had been filed away with a notation stating that family matters were not within state jurisdiction absent evidence of specific crimes. The notation was signed by a clerk whose brother-in-law had received a substantial loan from Adderley funds to start a business in Louisville. The machinery of influence ground on, protecting its own. But nature, or something beyond nature, had its own timeline. On April 6, 1895, an earthquake struck eastern Kentucky, a moderate tremor that caused minor damage across 3 counties. At the Gray House on Kettle Creek, the earthquake caused a catastrophic failure. The house, built on limestone bedrock that had been slowly eroding from underground water flow, partially collapsed. The western wing, which contained the family's living quarters, fell into a sinkhole that opened beneath it. 4 adults and 3 children were killed instantly. The survivors, trapped in the remaining structure, sent for help. The response from Willow Hollow was slow. Some said deliberately slow. It took 3 days for a rescue party to reach the Gray House. 3 days during which the surviving Adderleys remained trapped in the wreckage. When rescuers finally arrived, they found a scene that would defy coherent description in the newspaper accounts that followed. The survivors had not simply waited for rescue. In the collapsed cellar, accessible through a crack in the foundation, rescuers found evidence of what the trapped family members had done in their desperation. The sealed medical report, opened years later, contains testimony from Thomas Deacon, a local carpenter who participated in the rescue. "We heard sounds coming from below, rhythmic pounding and low chanting. When we broke through the rubble, we found the remaining Adderleys, 6 adults and 4 children, in the cellar among those jars of preserved specimens. They had broken several jars and were engaged in a ritual I cannot describe as anything but obscene. The bodies of their dead family members, those killed in the collapse, had been arranged in a circle. Candles burned at each cardinal point. And the living family members were cutting themselves, collecting their blood in bowls, mixing it together and anointing the dead. Silas, who had survived despite his age, was leading the ritual. When we interrupted, he looked at us with an expression not of surprise or embarrassment, but of fury that we had disrupted something sacred. He said, "You cannot let the blood be lost. It must return to the earth here, where it began. It must feed the soil so the trees will remember what we were." We pulled them out by force. They fought us. The children bit and scratched with an animalistic ferocity. One of the boys, perhaps 10 years old, latched onto my arm with his teeth, and I had to strike him to break free. His teeth left marks that looked more like an animal bite than a child's mouth should make. The Adderley family, what remained of it, was temporarily housed in the town while their property was assessed. The dead were buried in a hastily consecrated section of the local cemetery, far from other graves. The living family members were offered accommodations at the inn, paid for by their own wealth, but they refused to separate. All 10 of them crowded into a single room, barricading the door at night, emerging only for meals that they took in complete silence. The town's children began having nightmares. Several families reported that their sons and daughters woke screaming, claiming that the Adderley children were in their rooms, standing at the foot of their beds, watching them sleep. Parents dismissed it as mass hysteria fueled by adult gossip overheard by young ears. but the descriptions were too consistent. Every child reported the same details. The Adderley children stood perfectly still, did not blink, did not breathe visibly, and their eyes reflected lamplight like animal eyes caught in the dark. On April 18th, a 5-year-old girl named Emma Pritchard was found standing in her nightgown in the town square at 3 in the morning. When her frantic parents located her, she was starring at the inn where the Adderleys were staying. She did not respond to her name. When her father picked her up to carry her home, she spoke in a voice he later described as not her own, deeper and older. "They're calling," she said. "The blood calls to blood. They want us to come. All the children, they want us to come and join the family." Emma had no memory of leaving her bed or speaking those words, but for weeks after, she would wake and find herself standing at her window, facing south toward Kettle Creek, with no recollection of rising. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The situation could not continue. On May 1st, 1895, the town council held an emergency session and made a decision that existed in a legal gray area but was deemed necessary for the community's safety and sanity. The Adderley family would be offered a choice: accept supervision from state authorities who would evaluate the children's welfare and require the family to integrate into normal society, including education for the children and an end to isolated living, or leave Kentucky entirely. The offer was presented by Judge Curtis himself, accompanied by the sheriff and 4 armed deputies. The meeting took place in the judge's chambers. No record of what was said exists officially, but the judge's wife, in a letter to her sister dated May 5th, described what her husband told her that night. Silas listened to the ultimatum with a calmness that unnerved everyone present. When the judge finished, Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You think you can separate what God has joined. You think your laws override blood. We have been joined in the old way, the pure way, and what we have created will not be undone by frightened, small-minded fools who cannot see beyond their own limited understanding. But you need not worry about our presence disturbing your fragile peace. We will leave your town. We will go deeper into the hills where no roads reach, where no laws penetrate, where we can continue the work without interference. And in time, perhaps not in your lifetime but in your grandchildren's time, what we have cultivated will emerge, and you will see what purity looks like, and you will understand what you rejected." The judge said Silas's eyes when he spoke were not the eyes of a sane man, but of someone who had glimpsed something beyond sanity and could not return. On May 7th, 1895, the Adderley family departed Willow Hollow. They purchased supplies for a journey into the deep wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. Territory so remote that it appeared on no maps, land that belonged to no county and was patrolled by no law. They loaded 6 wagons with provisions, tools, seeds, and those jars from the cellar, carefully packed in sawdust. The town watched them leave in silence. No one waved. No one said goodbye. The procession moved south on the main road, then turned onto a logging trail that led into the mountains, and then they were gone, swallowed by forest so thick that the wagons disappeared from view within 100 yards. Several men from the town followed at a distance, curious to see where the Adderleys would settle, but the trail became impassable for horses after 5 miles. The men returned, reporting that the wagons had simply continued on footpaths into terrain where even experienced hunters rarely ventured. One of the men, a tracker named Samuel Yates, noted something disturbing in his report to the sheriff. "The children," he said, "were carrying loads that grown men would struggle with. Not just carrying them, but carrying them easily, as if weight meant nothing to them. And they moved through that rough country like they were born to it, like the terrain was welcoming them home. I've hunted those mountains for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone move through them like that. It wasn't natural. It was like watching fish return to water." The town of Willow Hollow tried to move on. The gray house property was left abandoned. No one would purchase it, even at drastically reduced prices. The sinkhole that had swallowed part of the structure remained open, a dark wound in the earth that locals began to avoid. Children dared each other to approach it, but none would get closer than 100 feet. They said they could hear sounds from within, whispers and movements, though the structure was supposed to be empty. In June of 1895, a group of teenagers decided to explore the ruins. They went at midday, 5 strong boys who mocked the fears of their elders. They returned 3 hours later, 4 of them. The 5th boy, Martin Griggs, was found 2 days later, wandering the woods 5 miles from the gray house, naked, covered in scratches, unable to speak. He never fully regained his speech. For the rest of his life, he communicated through writing and gestures. The one time he tried to describe what happened, he managed only a few sentences on paper before his hand began to shake too violently to continue. "We went into the cellar," he wrote. "There were still jars. We broke one, and what was inside was not dead. It moved. It looked at us. Then the walls started bleeding, not blood but something thicker, darker, and we heard children singing, but there were no children there. We ran, but Martin didn't follow, and when we went back for him, he was standing in the cellar, staring at nothing, and he wouldn't respond, wouldn't move, until we dragged him out by force." Martin Griggs died in 1923 in an asylum where he had drawn pictures on every available surface. The pictures were all the same: a house by a creek, and figures in the windows, too many figures, overlapping, all with the same face. For 3 years after the Adderleys departed, Willow Hollow existed in an uneasy peace. The town prospered without their dominating presence. New businesses opened. Families moved in from neighboring counties. The sawmill, now operated by a consortium of local investors, employed more men than ever before. But the gray house remained, a rotting monument on Kettle Creek, and as it rotted, the stories grew. Hunters reported seeing lights in the ruins at night, flickering like candles, though no one lived there. Fishermen claimed the water downstream from the property tasted wrong, metallic, and bitter, and that fish caught there were pale, their flesh soft and strange textured. In the autumn of 1898, a particularly heavy rain caused severe flooding along Kettle Creek. When the waters receded, they revealed that the sinkhole beneath the gray house had expanded, exposing more of the foundation. Curiosity drew several townsfolk to examine what had been uncovered. They found another room, one that had not been documented in any plans or surveys of the property. The room was small, windowless, accessed only through a narrow passage. On the walls were painted symbols, not Christian iconography but something older, geometric patterns that hurt to look at for too long. And in the center of the room was a well, hand-dug, descending into darkness that a dropped stone would fall into for a full 5 seconds before hitting water far below. On the rim of the well, carved in letters that looked fresh despite the room being sealed for who knew how long, were words in a language that the local minister tentatively identified as a corrupted form of Latin mixed with something he could not recognize. He refused to translate more than a fragment. Blood to stone, stone to blood, the circle remains unbroken. The well was sealed with boards and covered with stones, a task completed hastily and with as few workers as possible. Those who participated in sealing it reported feeling watched throughout the process, though the ruins were empty, and several mentioned experiencing severe headaches that lasted for days afterward. One man, Joseph Hammond, claimed that after working near the well, he began dreaming in a language he did not know, waking with words on his lips that he could not remember, but that left him feeling profoundly disturbed. His wife noted that he would sometimes speak in his sleep, long passages in a guttural tongue that sounded like instructions or prayers, and that during these episodes his eyes would be open, staring at nothing, or perhaps at something only he could see. In December of 1898, the town council voted to burn what remained of the gray house. The motion passed unanimously. On December 20th, a crew of 10 men doused the ruins in kerosene and set them ablaze. The fire burned for 2 days, far longer than the remaining wood should have sustained. The smoke rose black and thick, and those downwind from it reported that it smelled not like burning timber but like burning meat, though nothing living was supposed to be in the structure. When the fire finally died, the site was bulldozed, the well filled with concrete and rubble, and the entire property declared cursed ground. A local ordinance was passed prohibiting building on the site in perpetuity. The land where the gray house stood would be allowed to return to wilderness, and within a generation, the forest reclaimed it, growing over the scars until only those who knew what to look for could find the foundations. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? But the Adderleys themselves were not forgotten, though the town tried desperately to forget. In 1901, a hunter named David Moss returned from a weeks-long expedition deep in the mountains south of Willow Hollow. He told a story at the local tavern that was dismissed as the product of too much isolation and possibly tainted water. Moss claimed he had found a settlement far up in the hills, accessible only by paths that seemed to appear and disappear depending on how you looked at them. He described a collection of rough cabins built in a tight circle around a central clearing, and in that clearing he saw people. They looked like the Adderleys, Moss said, but wrong, more wrong than I remembered them being. There were more of them than should have been possible, maybe 20 or 30, and I couldn't tell the children from the adults because they all moved the same way, with that too fluid motion. I watched from cover for maybe 10 minutes. They were engaged in some kind of work in the central clearing, digging or planting, I couldn't tell which. And they moved in unison, like a machine with many parts, starting and stopping together, turning together. No one spoke. No one needed to. It was like watching ants, a colony with one mind distributed among many bodies. And then one of them, a woman I think, stopped and looked directly at where I was hiding, though I was 100 yards away and concealed behind thick brush. She didn't point or call out, she just looked. And then they all looked, all at once, all in the same direction, all with that same expression of knowing. I ran. I ran so hard I lost my rifle and my pack, and I didn't stop until I hit a road I recognized. I will never go into those mountains again. Moss's story was recorded in the diary of the town's new minister, Reverend Paul Henderson, who arrived in Willow Hollow in 1900. Henderson was a young man, ambitious, determined to bring modern religious thought to what he perceived as a backward community. He interviewed several longtime residents about the Adderley family, intending to write a thesis on isolated religious communities and their deviant practices. His research notes, found among his effects after he left the ministry in 1904, show a progression from academic interest to disturbed obsession to outright terror. In an entry dated March 19, 1902, Henderson wrote, "I have compiled accounts from 14 individuals regarding the Adderley family. The consistency of certain details is remarkable and troubling. Every witness describes the children as moving in synchronization, as if choreographed. Every witness mentions eyes that reflect light abnormally. Every witness reports feeling watched after encounters, even brief ones, for weeks or months afterward. Most disturbing are the accounts of dreams. 7 of my interviewees, who had no contact with each other and were interviewed separately, described having the same recurring dream after the Adderleys left town. In the dream, they are walking through the forest and come upon a clearing. In the clearing is a circle of children, the Adderley children, standing hand in hand. The circle is impossible, too large, containing more children than the family actually had. And as the dreamer approaches, the children begin to sing, a wordless melody that is beautiful and terrible, and the dreamer feels an overwhelming urge to join the circle, to take a hand and become part of the pattern. Those who resist the urge wake up. Those who succumb find themselves in the dream walking toward the circle, and then everything goes white, and they wake with no memory of what happened in that whiteness, but with a profound sense of having lost something, or perhaps having given something away." Reverend Henderson's final entry, dated September 2, 1904, is barely legible, the handwriting deteriorating into frantic scrawl. "I should not have gone looking. I should have heeded the warnings. But academic pride, the need to see with my own eyes, drove me into those mountains. I hired a guide, a man who claimed to know the paths, though he refused to go beyond a certain point. I continued alone. I found the settlement David Moss described, but it had changed, grown. There were structures now that looked like a village, crude but functional, and the population had clearly increased. I counted at least 40 individuals, and their features, God help me, their features were becoming more uniform. They were starting to look not like a family with shared traits but like copies, variations on a single template. The children were the worst. There were so many children, far more than could have been born in the 9 years since the family left Willow Hollow. And they looked at me, all of them, with recognition, as if they had been expecting me, waiting for me. One of them approached, a girl perhaps 12 years old, though her eyes were ancient. She spoke, and her voice came from everywhere, not just from her mouth, but from the trees, the ground, the air itself. She said, "You came to document. Document this. The blood has been purified. The line is strong. We are becoming what we were always meant to be. And when we are complete, when the final generation is born, we will return. We will return to the towns that rejected us, and we will show them what they could have been. We will show them what purity looks like. Tell them we are coming." I fled. I rode through 2 nights without stopping. I resigned my position. I am leaving Kentucky. I am leaving the ministry. Some things man was not meant to study, some darkness should remain unexplored. If you are reading this, heed my warning. Stay away from those mountains. Stay away from Kettle Creek. And if you dream of a circle of children singing, wake yourself by any means necessary. Do not join the circle. Do not give them what they want. The Reverend's papers were found by his successor, who filed them away, disturbed but uncertain what to do with such claims. For 20 years, they gathered dust in the church basement until a fire in 1924 destroyed most of the building. The papers were among the few items saved, pulled from the smoke by a volunteer firefighter who, upon reading them, suffered a nervous breakdown and had to be institutionalized for 6 months. The town of Willow Hollow entered the 20th century trying to modernize, to forget, to become like any other prosperous small American town. But the past, especially a past like theirs, does not stay buried. In 1917, during the First World War, several young men from Willow Hollow were conscripted. Among them was Thomas Deacon, Jr., son of the carpenter who had helped rescue the Adderleys from the collapsed gray house. Thomas served in France, survived the trenches, and returned in 1919. But he returned changed, and not just in the ways war changes men. His family noticed he had developed a habit of staring south, toward the mountains, for hours at a time. He would wake screaming about circles and blood and children with too many teeth. In November of 1919, Thomas disappeared. A search party found his truck abandoned on an old logging road that led toward the deep mountains. Tracking him proved impossible. The trail simply ended, as if he had been lifted from the earth. His body was never found, but 3 months later, a trapper found Thomas's dog tags hanging from a tree branch 20 miles into the wilderness, tied with a lock of hair that DNA testing, decades later, would prove did not match any human genetic profile on record. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Between 1920 and 1935, a pattern emerged that only became clear when examined in retrospect. Every few years, someone from Willow Hollow would be drawn into the mountains and would not return. Sometimes they were troubled individuals, people with family histories connected to the Adderleys. Sometimes they were curious teenagers seeking adventure. Sometimes they were outsiders passing through who heard the stories and wanted to investigate. None returned, or if they did, they were not the same. In 1928, a journalist from Louisville named Margaret Crane came to Willow Hollow researching a book on American folk horror and isolated communities. She conducted extensive interviews, examined records, and despite warnings, ventured into the mountains with a photographer. The photographer returned alone after 5 days, his equipment smashed, his film exposed, his mind shattered. He could only repeat one phrase: "They're not human anymore. They're becoming something else, something we don't have words for." Margaret Crane was found 2 weeks later, alive but fundamentally altered. She could not or would not explain what happened. She wrote nothing about her experience. But for the remaining 40 years of her life, she painted, obsessively, thousands of paintings, all depicting the same scene. A circle of figures, barely humanoid, joined hand to hand to hand to hand, spiraling inward toward a center that the viewer's eye could not quite focus on. Art critics called her work disturbing but powerful, never knowing that what she painted was not imagination but memory, a memory she could not escape even in sleep. The final documented encounter with the Adderley bloodline occurred in 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression. A government surveyor named Robert Chen was mapping wilderness areas for potential conservation projects. His route took him through the mountains south of Willow Hollow, territory that had been deliberately left off most maps due to its inaccessibility, and though this was not stated officially, due to the persistent reports of strangeness associated with the area. Chen was a practical man, educated, skeptical of superstition. He filed reports daily via shortwave radio to his base camp. For 2 weeks, his reports were routine: topographical data, water sources, timber quality. On day 15, his report was concerning. He described finding evidence of habitation far deeper in the wilderness than should have been possible. Structures, gardens, a well, and people, though he hesitated to call them that. His exact words, preserved in National Archives records, were, "The settlement I discovered today should not exist. There is no road, no supply line, no connection to any civilized infrastructure. Yet I count at least 50 individuals living in conditions that are primitive but organized. They dress in homespun cloth. They speak rarely, and when they do, it is in a dialect I cannot place, mixed with sounds that are not quite speech. But what disturbs me most is their uniformity. They look related, all of them too related. And the children, there must be 30 children, all appear to be the same age. All with identical features. I attempted to approach and introduce myself. They did not respond to my greeting. They simply watched me with eyes that did not blink, and I felt, for the first time in my adult life, primal fear. I am returning to base camp immediately. This site should be quarantined." Chen's radio went silent after that transmission. A rescue party was dispatched. They found his camp equipment, his notes, his surveying tools, all carefully arranged in a perfect circle in a clearing. At the center of the circle was Chen's radio, smashed beyond repair. And in a tree at the edge of the clearing, carved deep into the bark, was a message. "The blood is pure. The cycle is complete. The return begins." Robert Chen was never found. The area was declared off-limits, officially due to dangerous terrain, but those involved in the decision knew the real reason. In 1934, the Civilian Conservation Corps was tasked with projects throughout eastern Kentucky. The mountains south of Willow Hollow were explicitly excluded from their work orders, with a notation that the area was unsuitable for development or human activity. That notation remains in place today, nearly a century later, a bureaucratic ghost protecting a secret that no one wants to confront. The town of Willow Hollow still exists, though it has shrunk from its peak population. The young leave, seeking opportunities elsewhere, and few newcomers settle there. Those who remain do not speak of the Adderleys, not to outsiders, sometimes not even to each other. But they know. They know that on certain nights when the wind is right, you can hear singing from the mountains, children's voices in harmony, a melody that is beautiful and wrong. They know that sometimes hikers go missing, and when search parties enter those mountains, they find nothing, or worse, they find evidence that whoever they're looking for went willingly, joyfully, towards something they should have fled. In 1997, a team of genetic researchers from the University of Kentucky became interested in isolated Appalachian populations as part of a study on genetic drift and inherited conditions. They came across references to the Adderley family in historical medical records. Intrigued by the documented effects of sustained intermarriage, they sought to locate descendants for study. Their research led them to Willow Hollow, to the old records, to the stories. One researcher, Dr. Ellen Voss, became obsessed with the case. She filed requests to access the sealed reports, the medical documents, the sheriff's letters. What she found led her to write a paper that was rejected by every academic journal she submitted it to, not because of its methodology, but because of its implications. The paper, which circulated as an underground document among geneticists before being quietly suppressed, presented a disturbing hypothesis. Dr. Voss argued that the Adderley family had not simply suffered the negative effects of inbreeding, but had potentially, through extreme selection pressure and genetic isolation over multiple generations, begun to diverge from baseline humanity. She cited the consistent reports of unusual physical characteristics, the synchronization of behavior, the apparent shared consciousness described by witnesses. She suggested, cautiously, that what the Adderleys had created was not simply a damaged bloodline, but possibly something that could be classified as a subspecies, a branch of humanity adapting to extreme genetic restriction by developing characteristics that compensated for the loss of genetic diversity. Her conclusion was chilling. If the Adderley population has survived and continued their practices into the present day, they represent either a genetic dead end that will collapse into sterility and extinction, or a successful adaptation that has produced something that is no longer entirely human in any meaningful sense. Given that reports of activity in their suspected territory have continued for over a century, the latter possibility cannot be dismissed. Dr. Voss attempted to organize an expedition into the mountains to locate the Adderley settlement. Her funding was quietly denied. Her academic position was terminated for reasons that were never fully explained. She continued her research independently until 2003, when she suffered a stroke that left her unable to speak or write. Before the stroke, she told a colleague in what would be her final coherent conversation, "I found them. I found where they are. Or rather, they found me. I've been dreaming about them, the circle of children, every night for 6 months, and last week I woke up and I wasn't in my bed. I was in my car 50 miles from home on a road heading toward Kentucky. I had no memory of driving there. They're calling people. Even now, even after all this time, they're calling. And some part of us, some part buried deep in our genetic memory wants to answer, wants to join, wants to be part of whatever they've become." The colleague who shared this story did so anonymously, refusing to be identified, and only after the statute of limitations on involuntary commitment proceedings had expired. Today, the mountains south of Willow Hollow remain largely unexplored. They are not officially restricted, but word has spread among hiking communities, conservationists, and adventure seekers that the area is dangerous, unlucky, wrong. Those who ignore the warning sometimes return with stories. Stories of finding structures that should not exist. Stories of seeing people who do not quite move right. Stories of hearing singing that seems to come from inside your own head. And stories of feeling watched, followed, called. The gray house site is now completely overgrown, invisible unless you know exactly where to look. The creek still runs dark. The trees grow thick. And on certain nights, lights are seen among those trees, moving in patterns, circles within circles, something living and dancing and waiting in the darkness. The question that remains, the question that no one has been able to answer definitively, is whether the Adderley bloodline still exists, still continues, still practices the unions that created them. The last confirmed sighting was in 1933. That was over 90 years ago. If they survived, if they continued, there would be 5, perhaps 6 more generations born in isolation, each one potentially more changed, more adapted, more wrong. The children of those children, what would they look like now? What would they be? And if Dr. Voss was right, if they are calling, reaching out through dreams and compulsions and genetic memory, pulling people into the mountains, adding new blood to the line, then they are not simply surviving. They are growing. They are preparing. The town of Willow Hollow keeps its secrets close, carved into its silence like words carved into the rim of a well, blood to stone, stone to blood. The circle remains unbroken. And in the mountains where no maps reach, where the trails appear and disappear, where the singing echoes through the trees on windless nights, something waits. Something that was human once or close enough. Something that remembers what it was and dreams of what it will become. something that knows the blood calls to blood, and that eventually, inevitably, the call will be answered. The question is not whether they still exist. The question is what will happen when they decide the time has come to return, to show the world what purity looks like, to complete the circle that began in 1885 in a house by a creek where the water ran dark and the windows reflected the sky in ways that hurt to look at too long. The circle remains unbroken. And somewhere in the deep mountains, in a place that should not exist, children are singing. They have always been singing. They will always be singing. And one day, someone will listen. One day, someone will join, and the circle will grow.